tonight. It's wonderful to see so many people here to celebrate the history of the Bismarck Public Library. My name is Waldera, and I'm kind of wearing two hats tonight. One is president of the Bismarck Historical Society, and the other as head of reference services here at the Bismarck Public Library. So I'm just thrilled to death to see so many friendly faces in the audience, and I hope I can live up to your expectations this evening. Okay, the history of the Bismarck Public Library is a story that really needs to be told. I remember a number of years ago, I was given the archives for the library, and it basically consisted of probably at least about half a dozen boxes, and things had just been put in there willy-nilly over the years, and they decided it was time to organize it, and they said, well, Kate will do a good job. So I inherited that, and I spent the next 7 or 8 months going through the material and just reveling at the dedication that I saw written in the letters that people had written, in correspondence, just the dedication that people had to this library over the years. And so, as I said, it's definitely a story that needs to be told. The history of the library, I'm kind of come at it through the back door, and I'll let you try to figure out why. The Commercial Club, now the Bismarck Manhattan Chamber of Commerce, was formed in 1906, and it was headquartered in several buildings over its history. The Patterson Hotel, the Rood Building on 3rd Street, and then finally in the Hinckley Building on 4th Street. And you may be asking, what does this have to do with the library? Well, the pioneer women in Bismarck, they decided that the reading room was needed, and so they had a small one set up, and that was right at almost at the very inception of the city in 1873. And then in 1915, a joint project from the Civic League and the Commercial Club, with guidance from the State Library Commission, they solicited from the city residents books. And then they were housed and checked out from the rooms in the Commercial Club. And the secretary, as is typical of secretaries, they get all kinds of interesting jobs. The secretary was the librarian. And so the library story begins. Correspondence between the local residents of Bismarck, the committee that was assigned to do this, began in 1916 with the Carnegie Corporation in New York. And they were renowned for giving money for libraries, and there's a lot of Carnegie libraries that are still left in the country as well. And interestingly enough, when I was going through the history, I noticed that just about 100% of the correspondence was done between Clyde L. Young as the secretary of the committee and the Carnegie Corporation. So it was really interesting to watch the trail of development as it went along. And then the Board of Education, in April of that same year, also appointed the very first library board. And those people were Colonel C.B. Little. He was the president. Clyde L. Young was the secretary. And then there was Mrs. Patterson, Otto Holta, and George Will. They were all on the first library board. And for people that may not be familiar, C.B. Little, I'm just learning how to use this, by the way. C.B. Little was a businessman, lawyer, banker, political figure. He was known for helping establish the Provident Life Insurance Company, and he served as its president for a number of years. And then Clyde L. Young was a lawyer. Other positions he had were assistant attorney general and city attorney. Otto Holta was a businessman, and he also was a school board member. And then George Will, he was the son of Oscar Will, founder of the first nursery in North Dakota, known as the Oscar Will Seed Company. And then several sites were considered for the library. Most of them had to do around 5th and Thayer, near where the Methodist church had been. But finally, what worked out really well is that the city donated the property on the southwest corner of 6th and Thayer for the library, free of charge. That's always a good thing. And also, thanks to the efforts of Clyde L. Young and Commissioner Beatty, the city also pledged to appropriate annual budgetary money for the running of the library. So thanks to them, the library had money to work with over the course of their existence. And then in late 1916, the money from the Carnegie Corporation was awarded, and then it was time to start letting bids for the building. Contracts were let in and awarded in May of 17. Frederick Keith was the architect of the Carnegie Library. And for people interested in old and wonderful things, back on the back table, where the blue tabletop is one of the pages from the original Carnegie Library blueprints. And then general contractor was John Larson from Bismarck. Heating and plumbing was Grams and Pete. And electrical was J.L. Turney. And then within 3 weeks after the contracts were awarded, the ground was broke for the new library. And the building moved actually really pretty fast. He had the roof almost done in September, and they were starting work on the interior at that time. And so while all the construction was underway, it was time for them to find a new library, or find a librarian. And Florence Davis from Grand Forks was hired as the librarian. She had worked at UND for a number of years as the dean. She also had been a teacher as well in a previous life. But she came to us from Merrickville, Ontario. And she was here at Bismarck Public Library until 1925, and then she left and went up the street to the State Historical Society, and she was librarian there until she retired in 1949. And what I think is real amusing is she was hired for a whopping salary of $1,000 a year, which basically amounted to a scant $84 a month. And then the first janitor, Angus McDonald, was also hired around pretty close to that time too. His salary was $60 a month. And I have an amusing story to relate with regards to the janitor, the coal, and the librarian. And you wonder how those three things can possibly have anything in common. Well, back during the winter of 1918 and 1919, the board was doing its job and being fiscally frugal, and they were questioning the high amounts of coal that were being used to heat the library, to the tune of maybe like $18 a month. You know, they were very concerned about that. And so the librarian made a proposal that they be closed on Sunday, and that would not require the building to be heated quite so much, and they could save money on that. The board had a real interesting solution. They felt that the library was far too busy on Sunday to be closed. So the librarian came back and said that she did not feel that she could give 7 days a week to the work. So the board secretary was then directed to check with the janitor, to see if he would be interested in working on Sunday. I chuckled when I read that. That was so funny. And the library was finally opened toward the end of 1917. The dates I've heard are either November 1st, I saw that date. I've also seen the December date. So I'm not exactly sure when it opened, but it was toward the end of that year. And obviously it was very popular with the community. By 1919, they circulated almost 14,000 books. And then within 20 years, we went up to over 184,000 books. And the interesting thing is I haven't been able to really find hours. There was one piece of information in some of the minutes that I read, and that's the only place I found anything that mentioned hours. But apparently they they did let them have lunch hours and supper hours. And then just kind of a walk through memory lane on some pictures from the Carnegie days at the library. How many of you remember the Carnegie Library? Yep, in story times in about the early 50s. And one thing that I was really happy is that I was able to track down information on all the library directors that we've had since 1917. And back on the display at the end of the room, I do have all the pictures. Some were harder to find than others, but I did find them. And other directors that came after Davis were Pauline Rich and Helen Kennedy, both came from Montana. And then Ruth King had worked at what is now known as Northern State University, but back then it was known as Normal and Industrial School in Aberdeen. Helen Lawin came to us from Washington State. And then Uranus Stadler and Robert E. Thomas were both from Wisconsin. And Uranus Stadler was here, she dedicated almost 13 years. So up until that point, she'd been the longest serving director at our library. And then after Thomas came Andrew Hansen. And remember, in the early years, the only staff people that were in the library were the librarian and the janitor. That was pretty much it. And obviously, with the growing community, and Bismarck was growing, all you have to do is look at the census to see how quickly they were expanding. More space was needed, and additional library staff as well. And so they started hiring people to do work in the children's area, or to work at the checkout desk, or to get materials ready to go on the shelves. Those were all jobs that the lone librarian had to do in addition to helping all the public that came in as well. And under Andrew Hansen, the work began for a new library building to replace the building. And it was, reading in the minutes, there was much discussion as to where this new library would be. And it was very important to the board and to Hansen that it stay in the downtown, or at least as close as possible to the downtown area. And there were a number of locations that were considered, but they finally decided on the northwest corner of 6th and Avenue A. And for people that are interested, in May of '62, the Quain House was moved from this spot, and it was moved to the 2100 block of East Rosser, and that house was converted into apartments. But that was the home that sat on this corner up until '62. And the Veterans Library then was completed in '63. And the money was from what was called the Veterans Memorial Levy. And that was basically money that was in honor of the World War II and Korean War veterans. And some of the stipulation for that was that it could not be, you couldn't take the pot and split it up for many different projects. It had to be dedicated to one project. And I know there was some discussion, some people wanted to use it to build a pool. Well, I'm glad the library went out on that. And the architect for the Veterans Memorial Library then was the Ritterbusch brothers. And despite of what the picture shows, Andrew Hansen didn't get to reap the fruits of his labor. He accepted a job in Iowa, and he was gone before we were able to move into the building. And so the picture doesn't exactly show the move. I have a feeling it was more of a publicity shot to celebrate the fact that there was a new library and we were going to be moving. And so if we go clockwise from the back, the fellow right back here was an employee of the library. His name was Dwayne Seymour. And then right next to him in the back, next to the bushes, was Jess Cooper. And then we have Mr. Mayor, Tom Mayer, and he's sitting right in the audience.
Is that him sitting here?
Right
Is
here.
people pointing at it?
That's it, yeah. It changed so much.
Look exactly, and Andrew Hanson, of course. And I talked to Betty Mills, who had been on the library board at the time, and she was just chuckling because along 6th Street there was a parade of book trucks going back and forth up 6th Street, and that's how they moved books. They'd load up book trucks, they'd come trundling down 6th Street, and as they were coming up, the empty ones would be going in the opposite direction. And it was a long weekend of moving books from Carnegie to the Veterans Memorial Library. And then began to celebrate some of the memories of the Veterans Memorial Library, which is almost what it looked like when I started working here about 30 years ago. The advent of the record player, which was a real big thing, and headphones for the kids, and then the infamous card catalog. Anybody that's a librarian knows about the card catalog. And then, of course, views from the mezzanine level of the bookshelves and traffic in the library. And that is Avenue 8, I think it's over here. And I would guess that these pictures would probably be about from 1970, or at least the early 70s. Then after Hanson left, we had some, obviously other library directors. Richard Miller came to us, was born in Connecticut, and he came to us from California. Then Richard Wolford came to us from Illinois, and he was here for a couple of years before he became the state librarian for our state. And then after Mr. Wolford came James Tertine, and he came from and after he left Bismarck, he went on to the public library directorship at Bellevue, Nebraska, and then finished out his career as director of Siouxland Public Library Systems in Sioux Falls. And then, of course, Thomas Jones was Tertine's replacement. And Tom, you want to leave? Yeah, he retired in May of 2011 after serving as director for over 35 years. And then Christy D. Harms was Tom's replacement, followed by Mary Jane Schmaltz. And then today we have Christine Guiava. She's the newest library director. Then with the Bismarck Public Library, again, it was the issue of growing, both in terms of books and of traffic in the library, and it became rapidly apparent that we had already outgrown the new library, and that growth really accelerated in the late 60s and continued throughout the 70s. And then the board, in their foresight in the early 70s, began to buy property in the library block in anticipation for expansion. And then under Tom Jones's tenure in 1970, the library board initiated a lengthy planning process to identify needs for an expanded facility. And so in 1987 to 89, the library expanded, and the beauty of it is that they seamlessly incorporated the Veterans Memorial Library into this one. So what we're in now is the addition, but if you would go upstairs and look at the mezzanine level, basically that's over the coffee shop, that whole, from that mezzanine level south was the old library, but they so seamlessly incorporated it that some people think the whole building is brand new. And so basically we had 70,000 square feet, and it was $3.9 million to construct. And we did it in phases. The main part of the library was in 1989. And then the meeting room area where we're at now was done in about 1990. And then the lower level, which is on the other side where the bookshelves and the study rooms are, and that was done in, that was finished in 97. And yes, I remember plastic up everywhere. And staff members working like eager beavers, moving books and books and more books over from the old Veterans Memorial Library to the new one. I remember there was a hole punched in the wall, and that's where all the book truck traffic went through. And we closed the library, I think, for 2 or 3 days, was it, when you were moving? Which was almost unheard of, but we got it done through a lot of hard work and a lot of reshelving of materials, but it was a joyous time to move into that brand new facility. And then here's the library of today, the one that you are the most familiar with. And I thought it would be fun to see a statistical snapshot of what the library has been up to this past year. We have almost 45,000 card holders. There's been almost 354,000 visits to the library last year. And it just goes on and on. 51 databases, almost 39,000 reference questions answered at the information desk. And we're open almost 6,700 hours last year.
How do you count the visits?
The gate that you walk through in the front when you come in through the last set of doors, that ticks off every time you go through one way and every time you come back. Yep. And then we have the children's library, which was renovated in 2009. And the pride of the library was that it was done strictly on private donations. There was no city money involved with it. And as you can tell, the children enjoy it. They have over 400 events every 2004. They've got 6,600 kids that have library cards. And 38,000 items for the delight of all the youngsters that come into the library. And anyone that's been here on Storytime Day knows how excited and how popular that area is. And then the adults have good things too. We've got print material, obviously, we have the audio-visual things, but it's the digital that's really getting to be important. Anybody that's ever downloaded ebooks, the world is changing in libraries. The offerings are infinitesimal. And librarians act as gatekeepers, I think, to guide everyone toward that, toward all those treasures. We have public computers, free Wi-Fi, study rooms, meeting rooms, basic computer classes, genealogy assistance, tax forms. We have just about anything you can think of the library has or knows where you can find it. And when I think back to the early days of the library, everything was done by looking up in indexes and union catalogs. I remember reading in some of the librarians' reports about how busy they were putting together reading club packets for all the reading clubs. Because everything was in print. There was no way, nobody had computers back then to go online and get the information. Everything was done by hand, and I can imagine the amount of time that took. And just to think of the leaps and bounds that it's taken over the years, especially with the advent of technology, the big difference that it's made. And I think it would be fun to have the old library directors come back today and look at what's developed in libraries. I think they would be amazed, and maybe a little scared, but amazed. I know we offer book clubs as well, and all different types of other programs, such as Blind Date with a book. And then we have movie nights, library-sponsored and public programming. And then we have our Bookmobile that also brings the library to the outlying areas of the county. The first Bookmobile was dedicated in March of 1957. And they got the Bookmobile when it was still the Carnegie Library, and I remember seeing discussion about getting bids for the building a garage on the south side of the library, so there would be a good place to park the Bookmobile when it was in. But now it visits 83 locations, 4,000 card holders. It brings the library to the outlying areas. And it was interesting looking at some of the discussion too of whether or not to serve people that didn't live in the city. There was a big discussion about that in the early days. They felt that it was just the privilege of the city residents to have that library. And they finally, at some point, I forget the exact date, but there was discussion on whether they would allow it, and the board decided, yeah, we would do that, but they would pay a non-resident fee. Well, our non-resident fee for a library card now is for anybody that doesn't live in Burleigh County. For them, it was people that didn't live in the city. And I think it was either $1 or $2 to have that privilege. And finally, that was just laid by the wayside altogether, and everyone was welcome in the library. And the Burleigh County Bookmobile, they go to not only the schools during the school year, but they also visit the retirement communities. One of the programs that they've had is with Nooks, because there's a lot of different book clubs in the retirement setting. And you'd be amazed, they love their Nooks, and we preload books on there for them, and so they can have their book discussions. And of course, the kids, every opportunity we have in the community for the Bookmobile is there. And I am really intrigued by this particular gentleman. This is Clyde L. Young. He served continuously on the library board from the time he was appointed in 1916 until he retired in 1961. He was the active liaison between the local committee and the Carnegie Corporation. And as I said before, he ensured that the library had a working annual budget from the city when they were developed. But the dedication that he had to be on the board for all those years, now by law there's term limits, and that wouldn't happen these days. But back then, to serve that long on the board was, to me, just amazing. And so I saw a number of places where he was referred to as the father of the Bismarck Public Library. And that is what I have for everyone tonight. I know I could stand up here for a long, long time and talk, just going through all the materials that I did. It's ripe for a book, and that's been hinted at many times. And oh, how nice it would be to have it in 2017, but I'll do the best I can. There's questions floating around out there, so talk loud, please, and I'll do my best to answer. Yes?
You've shown the evolution of the library since the early 20th century and great changes in physical planet. Would you like to prognosticate the next 50 years changes in the libraries? And the reason I asked that question, I guess it's sort of self-serving. My daughter Heather McCormack was the editor of Library Journal Review. She got headhunted by 3M Corporation 2 years ago, and she is now in charge of their iCloud technology of beaming books down to libraries all over the world. She's in London right now working with that, and she loves books and she collects them, but she says the changes that are coming are phenomenal. We look at the note culture, for example, and that libraries will become electronic communication centers. God forbid they should ever have books, but my students don't read books unless I force them, and they do. Force is good for reading books, I think. But the electronic and the social media, there's a whole sphere of technology that's coming, and I don't know how anybody can think what's going to happen in 50 years.
That would be really difficult, because I know just in the 30 years that I've been a librarian, I see the changes that have happened. When I went to grad at school. Computers were not in libraries that much. We still relied on the indexes and the card catalog and things like that. And the way of doing research was for people to come in and pay for me to do dialogue searches on databases. But now we have those databases wide open for the general public, and so many of the articles are full text, meaning the entire article. And the beauty of it is that it's free to the library user. So I'm seeing that, you know, it's going to be a wide open world. I see that stuff in the cloud, like you said. And it's really changed the way librarians work in the field as well. So much of it, and I'm not saying that it's not labor intensive now, but it's in a different way. I remember at the desk getting questions, and we didn't have the internet back then, mind you. We had to go through the indexes, and we had to do searches in the card catalog and find books that might have the answer, and pull them and look through them and mark pages and make copies, and it's changed so very much now. The library is basically a 24/7 entity, because there's remote access now with the internet. People can get to it from home. If they're insomniacs, they can get on it at 3 o'clock in the morning and look up books and find magazine articles and download ebooks onto their readers. It basically has opened the doors wide open, so the library really is never closed. And I see that as one of the benefits of the electronic age. And it's just going to be even more so. Does that answer your question? Okay, thank you, Mike. Yes?
Thank you for bringing up the Bookmobile, because I have fond memories of Bookmobile coming in the 60s where I lived. I was just curious, in your box of goodies that you got, was there any discussion on them expanding the Carnegie building, like south or
Yeah,
west?
that was something that did come up in some of the minutes. They talked about expanding to the south. They also talked about some other, and nothing was really clear, so I hesitate to say too much. They inferred that they had looked at other locations as well, but the building itself, it appeared that they were having electrical issues and some other things structurally with the library as well.
Did anything move into it after?
For a while, the municipal court was in that building. And then one day in the early 80s, the wrecking ball came, which makes me sad every time I think about it.
Yes.
Yes.
My first foray, I guess, into the Carnegie Library was when the city building inspector was in the basement. So there were some city offices in that building before it was raised.
Yeah, it was the municipal court. Yeah, they after they moved out, after the library moved out to the new building in this location, the municipal court was there, and I'm assuming, as you said, there were other city offices there as well. Yes, ma'am.
I know everybody's heard me tell this story, but it still is my favorite. I remember remembering things about the Carnegie Library for me. When you were young, the children's area, of course, was down in on the basement area. The little library cards were kind of a pale yellow, and they had kind of a metal thing up in the corner that they used for checking books out. And so you came into the building and went down into the children's area. And I can remember when I got my salmon-colored library card that allowed me to go up the steps into the real library. And I probably strutted around for days with my, look at my library card. It's salmon-colored.
Yeah, I remember seeing those that had that little metal plate. And I know when I do weeding of the books, we're getting rid of old materials, and I'm looking in there, and sometimes I'll still see the old book pocket or card pockets in the back, and you pull out the card, and it's got that V number stamped on it. And I'm sure it was very similar with the Carnegie Library number as well. Yes.
One thing I really appreciate is being able to borrow books from other libraries around the entire country. I use that a lot. Stuff that we don't have here, and they could maybe only find one copy of it like from Washington DC, that get shipped here for my use. I love that.
And that's the other thing that's so nice now with, you know, the interlibrary cooperation that there is. And I thank the computers for that to make it more streamlined and easy. I mentioned a little while back about the union catalogs. A lot of times they were bound books, and what they were is they list the titles, and then they'd have these rather cryptic symbols of libraries that have a book, you know, and then you'd have to write a letter to that library, maybe borrow your book, and then you'd wait. And then you get the letter back, no, it's checked out. And then you write another letter to another one. So it would be back and forth and back and forth. Now with the electronic, it just automatically bumps to the next location if it's not responded to in a certain period of time. So, yeah, interlibrary loan, the cooperation that libraries have always had is just amazing, and it's made even easier and more streamlined with the electronic age. Any other questions? Yes, sir.
Are there any books left from the 1917 era?
I
If you got
hesitate
pigeonholed somewhere
to
back?
say no, but more than likely, no. Well, yeah, the Missouri River Room would have some, that would be the one repository for the old stuff. The old things, especially if it was about Missouri River area, Bismarck, it would be in there. But as to being on the actual shelves and being checked out, probably not. And most of that's been culled out that had anything to do with the local area or the region. It would be in our Missouri River Room as a rare book. You're welcome. Anyone else, yes, sir?
Yeah, I remember back in the late 70s, 77 is the number that comes to mind, I'm not sure, but a petition was circulated for the Bookmobile, to have a Bookmobile.
Right.
How do you explain that? Because I was surprised to see you saying that it was actually started in 57, not 77.
Well, there was a period of time, I think, when the service was dropped,
Okay.
and I'm not sure what the reason was behind that. So basically, the first Bookmobile would have run for a number of years, and then the petition came out to reinstate the service. So there was a gap in time there when there wasn't a Bookmobile.
Yeah, I was wondering about that.
Now, so what we have now is almost like the second life, you know, for the Bookmobile. Yes, Tom?
That Richard Wolford was the librarian when they dropped that. Originally, it ran in the city, just in the city of Bismarck.
Oh, really?
Yeah. And I think it had to do with funding or something, and he didn't feel that they were getting enough funding, so he dropped it. And I'm thinking it was about 68, but I'm not real sure when his tenure was.
He would have been like about, let's see, because he came, would have been about 67 to 69, that 2-year period.
So I think they dropped it about 68, and then we restarted it in 75. The year I came, they had a Library Services and Construction Act grant from the state library, through the state library federal money, and they started the Bookmobile in Burleigh County and also Sioux County. They would run it here 3 weeks and then take it down to Sioux County and run it for a week. And so that was the original grant, and then we got a petition passed. In those days, you could pass a petition and establish the tax base. So the Bookmobile staff primarily, and they had a network of users out in Burleigh County, they circulated the petitions during 75, now 75 into 76, and actually the funding ran out in June 30th of 76, and they didn't get panicky about keeping it going until like May. They suddenly realized they didn't have enough signatures and it was going to die. So Marie Gilchrist was the librarian on the Bookmobile. I don't know whether any of you know her, Pinky, but anyway, she was a real go-getter. So she got some of the ladies out at like in Wing and some of those places in the senior center. She got them fired up, and they took the petitions out and they got them signed. You know? So they got her through. And of course, I had to go over to the county commission. They really weren't happy. They were not happy at all. They didn't think we'd make it. See, So we go carrying in all the petitions, and Ken Harlow, I don't know whether any of you remember him, he was the county auditor, and he was very much in favor of it. So he certified that they were all legitimate, and everything, so they established it. So it got reestablished with a tax base then in '76,
Okay.
and that's when the Burleigh County, so it was Burleigh County.
I was, I don't know if I should say this or not, I was just out of high school, I was one of those that thought it was a good idea, and I grabbed a petition myself and ran around the neighborhood with, so, I was thinking 77, but it must have been 76.
75, 76.
Is there any other questions?
Has there always been the association with Mandan? I know you can get the books over there and drop them off here, vice versa. When did that start?
That came, I think that would have been about in the was it the 80s or 90s when that cooperation came about, I think.
Well, I think it started when we put in the online system, which would have been '84.
Okay, yeah, that sounds about right then. So yeah, that cooperation with our city, started then. And then obviously with the Central Dakota Library Network, it's branched out not only to include Bismarck and Mandan Public Libraries, but University of Mary, United Tribes, and then some of the other smaller outlying libraries, the Plain Mercer System, Hazen, Beulah, Garrison. So it's really branched out a lot. And that, like I said, that's the beauty of the electronic age, where you have all this cooperation and it's easily done. Any other questions? Okay, well, thank you very